Hey everyone, this is Christian Heimel, host of Press Row. Thanks so much for listening to the following broadcast, courtesy of Public House Media.
This is Kim Meyer, the host of Choose to Rise here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my show, Choose to Rise, where we talk about living with positive mindsets, how to increase our confidence, building our faith, and living out our life on purpose. A new show comes out via podcast every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And if you want to catch the episode live instead, stop by Public House Media around 6:45 Central Standard Time, Monday, Wednesday, Friday as well. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you'll never miss an episode of Choose to Rise. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to another edition of Your Soccer Passport here on Public House Media. My name is Brice Burge.
And I'm Ivan Sanchez Carrasco. Today, Brice, we're going to follow up on the U.S. and Mexico's victories last week. We are going to talk about the Gold Cup, the 16-team field set, and also we got European qualifiers up for 2020.
Let's go straight into it here. Let's not waste any time. We'll talk about the Mexican national team first because they had the big victory with their matchup. It's also against the opponent that the United States will play the night of recording. Kind of creates an issue there. But Mexico defeated Chile by a score of 3-1, scoring all three goals before Chile got on the board. Doing it on just 8 shots, and all shots on target found the back of the net, with Jimenez, Moreno, and Lozano getting the goals for Mexico. What stood out to you in this matchup?
Following from last week when we talked about kind of what I was looking to see from the Mexican national team, part of it was the starting lineup and see if there's going to be a transition from last year's World Cup. But I saw a team who you can tell worked on pressure and how they something, and they just looked different from what Mexico under Osorio looked like in the manner that Tata had the team pressing. They looked like they pressed higher up the field, and where they initiated and where they wanted their forwards to press the back line, it looked like they wanted a little higher, hoping for Chile to play a bad pass in which the midfield can get the ball and or the back line can get the ball, and they kind of go from there. So that's kind of the main difference, and that's what I saw out of this Mexican national team. More specific things that I noticed, Jesus Gallardo, who Osorio made who usually plays the left wing, and Osorio made a left back for Mexico while his time in that with the national team. Tata has also continued with that. Gallardo started off on the left on the back four, which I thought was interesting, and then you had Edson Alvarez playing in the midfield for Mexico, more defensive midfield. So those were the kind of things that I noticed from what we talked about last week on what I was hoping to expect. You had Raul Jimenez, who got on the score sheet and scored the PK for Mexico, kind of leading that front line, coming off a really good victory, or coming off a really good season in the EPL. And then you had Lozano kind of being that spark plug that he's been for Mexico the last 4 years as well. And I think out of the quick thoughts I had, lastly, I thought Guardado still being called up for Mexico and still captaining the team is really important. He's the oldest guy on the team. He's 31, going to turn 32 this year, 151 caps for Mexico. And it'll be interesting to see if he can continue to be the leader of this team and be the one the captaining Mexico looking further along.
Well, Mexico's got a number of great young players that are there underneath them. So when you have the leadership questions that Mexico is going with, not just because you've got a changing of the guard per se, but you also have a managerial change, it creates an opportunity for a player to step up. I've always seen, regardless of sport, when you have that combination of older players kind of on their way out and managerial changes coming about, that is one of the easier ways for transition to happen in that locker room. I think the best example right now is probably what's going on with Dallas right now with Dirk Nowitzki and Luka Modric kind of changing things around. And it's It is a good spot to see players step up for this Mexican national team, because one, that leadership's going to be there, but even some of the aggressive formats, not getting frustrated out on the pitch. I didn't really see a team that looked like they were getting the negative things happen, like when a pass did go wrong. They only had 78% pass accuracy, which is lower than what they had underneath Osorio. They had 5 offsides, and I don't remember the last time they've had more than 2 offsides in a game, just because they are attacking so differently now underneath Tata Martinez. But you have that setup, and there wasn't a frustration, and there wasn't a negativity to that, and that shows that the natural process of leadership is really showing in that locker room, I think, in a way that is more positive than a lot of people might recognize outside of Mexico right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see kind of what you talk about, the leadership and transition of it, and you also have Hector Moreno there, who has been playing for Mexico for 10 years, starting in the back line. But then you have players like Giovanni Dos Santos, who currently doesn't even have a team, someone like Carlos Vela, who didn't get called up. And so you kind of see what those guys might be getting phased out. Maybe Tata's looking to the future and saying they might not be here for me. I have younger players who might be just as good as they are right now, or maybe a step below, but in 3 years, they're still going to be here. They're going to be above those players, but right, and maybe he doesn't see that with Guardado, where he can still see Guardado and Moreno and Ochoa on goal, who just celebrated his 100th game for Mexico, being players who are great right now and can still play a role in the future as well. And then that's kind of going to be interesting moving forward into this summer as well, especially when you have Raul Jimenez starting now for Mexico, and you have Chicharito Hernandez, who's been such a huge focal point for Mexico for so long, starting on the bench and coming off a bench. And if that still happens, how do those dynamics and transitions work?
We've seen that through other countries as well. We've seen that in France with Ribéry. We've seen that with Landon Donovan near the end of his career. But, Landon Donovan may not be the best example with how he was left off that World Cup roster. But when you have players that are starting to go in what route that they may be able to really be effective in, just the ability to run up and down the field, the physicality of soccer is so underappreciated. It's a big, difficult aspect when moving forward, especially for a team that's trying to figure out what their identity is. They have an identity. They're Mexican. They're the Mexican national team, but they don't necessarily have an identity because they haven't had a chance to play with each other enough. And that identity can only be scripted in your own words. You can't have somebody else script them for you on concept alone. And so when you have this team kind of come together and maybe this is a good way to transition into the American side, because they'll play this Chile team next, but they're also going through that same transition, whether or not guys like Josie Altidore or Bradley or some of the older guys will still be around, and you still have the ability to bring in some young talent. And again, it's all about actually putting the pen to paper and writing your team philosophy yourself. And I think we kind of saw that in the men's national game against Ecuador, where they won 1-0. Zardes scored in the 81st minute in what was an exceptionally low offensive game, with possession really being dominated by the United States, but only taking 5 shots, 2 of which were on target, and didn't score until almost the game was over. So it was an exceptionally boring possession game for the United States, kind of a different vibe than what we saw from the Mexican national team.
Yeah, I think part of it has to do Ecuador not playing their part either. And in Ecuador's defense, this is their first game since the World Cup qualifier against Argentina in October of 2017. So they kind of haven't had a chance to really – they have had their national team kind of a stall. And so I think the U.S. tried to do the best they could against what the opponent offered them. But this kind of goes into something that the U.S. national team will have to get used to if they continue to advance and progress under this new regime, is how can you break down a team who sits back and absorbs pressure and is okay giving up 65% of the possession, something that the U.S. in years past have been very used to is giving up possession, finding the counters. I mean, you kind of see it in the offsides where Ecuador has 3 offsides for almost every 10% of possession, and that's because they're looking to hit on the counter. And this is kind of something that's new territory for the U.S. national team when you're going to play against a style like that. So it'll be interesting to see how they're able to adapt and adjust moving forward when they get kind of pushed in that situation where teams are giving them the ball and asking them to break them down, to find gaps behind the back line, to have Pulisic make runs, to have Morris make runs. Can they break down a very compact, a very well organized back line? That'll be something interesting to see moving forward, especially as the quality of these opponents continue to improve when you look at tournaments moving forward. That's kind of what the takeaway and what I want to see with the U.S. national team and what I kind of wanted to see from this game.
Well, even with that setup, you've got substitutions that kind of showed a different story. I mean, the way that Berhalter kind of addressed that was by making multiple changes that took out Pulisic, that took out Morris. He ended up putting in Yedlin and Leggett to try to figure out how to move things in. He also pulled out Will Trapp and put Michael Bradley in there. Again, that kind of role. I mean, Michael Bradley came in first the 59th minute to really kind of shake things up and reset the way that the ball kind of gets into the box and gets into the attacking area, maybe finding that better pass through the experience that Bradley has compared to what Trapp does. But even in that setup, it didn't look like Pulisic was comfortable. Pulisic was definitely not expecting to play that game until he got pulled out. And I think it really kind of took a little bit of extra work from guys like Roldan to kind of like stretch the field out even laterally, east and west, not north and south, to kind of really force open a passing lane that I really just have not ever seen Pulisic do as an American on the national team. And it shows to me that there's still some very fatal flaws with the way that the United States is putting together their roster and putting together their availability on the pitch. It's not just whether or not you got an opponent that's willing to sit back, because most opponents are better than the United States. You don't have that except in, Gold Cup scenarios. But even in that regard, it creates opportunities back the other way, and it just kind of delays that national identity once again that this United States national team has been waiting years to try to figure out.
Yeah, and that's going to be the biggest question mark until Bill Halter's able to kind of get some consistency of it, is how can you get Pulisic, who by all accounts is the U.S. best player, how can you put him in the best position for him to succeed? Because I think the idea is once you're able to get him in a role where he feels more comfortable, then you start building around him, and then you hope everybody else also continues to get the best out of they can from it. Something I did notice from the game as well, that Yedlin came in as a right wing when in general for Newcastle he plays as a right back. And, are they trying to utilize his speed and his athleticism out wide and try to take on defenders a little more instead of what they kind of do and what he's kind of been known to do in the EPL is be a right back who can get up, but can also recover quick enough, and that's kind of been his MO kind of as a defender as well, his recuperation ability, because he's so athletic, because he's so quick. And then, you mentioned Bradley coming in, and when you watch Bradley, for all his faults, something he does tend to do, especially when I think he feels the U.S. team needs it, he does a pretty good job of pushing, even a defensive midfield role, kind of pushing the aggression a little bit. And something that I think Trapp will kind of need to learn how to do in his game, and is something that Bradley has been able to show and during his time as a national team, is he does have this ability to push the game forward when need to be, and kind of not be more direct, but just be a little more aggressive and have a little more urgency, I think. And in that, I think it's kind of it's interesting seeing that when he comes in as a sub, because then you kind of notice the difference a little more too, because all of a sudden it's this kind of like jolt of energy.
That will do it for this opening segment. Again, the games tonight will be during the day of recording, so they have yet to be played by the time that we talk about it. The U.S. will play that Chilean team that just lost to Mexico. Mexico, on the other hand, will be playing Paraguay in an interesting matchup as well. We'll take a quick break, and then when we return, we'll have some information about the Gold Cup qualifying, what that means for the teams involved, and more information here on Your Soccer Passport, presented by Public House Media.
This is John Lauder, host of The Cheap Seats here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my show, The Cheap Seats, where we talk about sports from the fans' perspective. A new show comes out every Monday. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of The Cheap Seats. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hello and welcome back to Public House Media's presentation of Your Soccer Passport. I am Brice Burge, Yvonne Sanchez Carrasco here as well, talking soccer of club and country from around the world. A lot of country because it's an international break, as well as some important things in terms of qualifiers. We will stick in North America and do the CONCACAF because the Gold Cup is set. A couple surprises, couple of expected teams to be there. Obviously, if you're in the Hex, you're in, which means Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Honduras, U.S., Trinidad, and Tobago are all in. Costa Rica and the U.S. are the co-hosts. Getting in on the qualifiers are the top 10 teams from the big mix-and-match scenario that was there below. That included Haiti, who took first overall, Canada, Martinique, Curacao, Bermuda, Cuba, Guyana, Jamaica, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. This is the first time that both Bermuda and Guyana have made it to the Gold Cup as well, with the group that had qualified the most times actually being Canada. This is their 14th appearance. One thing that kind of caught me by surprise, though, is that this is only Nicaragua's third appearance. So, as well as Jamaica's 11th appearance, but they were runners-up the last time through. So there's a number of really interesting setups with this so far with the teams that are involved.
Yeah, I think my biggest surprise of the team that's not making it is Guatemala. Just kind of shows how far they've kind of fallen in Central American soccer. The fact that they can't qualify to this tournament that's expanded. It used to be 12 teams, now it's 16, and they can't qualify for this tournament. And in the region that, quite frankly, is probably one of the weakest regions in the world, it just kind of shows how far they've fallen and how the federation really needs to take a step back and really try to clean up the corruption in the country in soccer and try to kind of just start anew to try to get something going again. Because the fact that there's only 5 Central American teams out of the 16 teams kind of mind-blowing to me. That's kind of my biggest takeaway from the teams who didn't make it, if you ask me.
Well, Belize was in a good spot, and they kind of faltered near the end. I mean, so many teams are at 2-1. This came down to goal differential for a lot of them. El Salvador and Nicaragua were your teams that finished 9th and 10th, and they got in because of a favorable draw. They were able to beat up on a couple of territories that have the ability to play games, not actual countries. And so even with Nicaragua and El Salvador making the tournament, it isn't necessarily one that I think that they can be happy about. They need to make some waves when they actually get there. I thought that with the teams that did make it, I saw a lot better play out of Belize, but I believe that Belize had a harder draw. I saw some better plays out of like some of the Caribbean teams as well. Some of the smaller island nations I thought had some scrappy performances where I thought that they might have been able to squeak it through, but again were on the wrong side of a 3-1 record with their goal differential. So I mean, those are just the way that the qualifying to get into this tournament happened was just so different and so catch you off guard type things that it really made a difference for these teams getting in. And I think if you're upset about Guatemala, then Nicaragua and El Salvador have to say, like, you know, they got to kind of be given like a side eye, like, don't look at me type thing, because they debatably are in the field.
Yeah, I'll definitely side eye those two countries too. It just kind of just shows how, when you look at a team like Jamaica, who have taken the time to really invest, and it looks like they are really putting a focus on their soccer federation the last couple of years, and it just kind of shows that even when they're not doing as well as they hope, they're still qualifying and they're doing it in the right way. And you know, like you said, they were in the finals a couple years ago. They made they made semifinals in the past as well. You know, they're obviously doing something right as a federation, that they're able, you know, every couple of years to still make the field. And when you have teams like El Salvador, Guatemala, who are soccer-rich nations or soccer-crazy nations, and they're not able to kind of figure it out or produce teams, you know, they have to. My side eye is not going to do a difference. They have to look in the mirror and say, what are we doing wrong, and why aren't we, you know, competing at this level especially when it comes down to small things like goal differential? Why aren't we doing enough to put ourselves in a better situation in our region to prosper? I think that's kind of, I mean, so big shout out to Cuba as well. Curacao, you know, Canada's who had to qualify for the first time instead of automatically getting a qualifying, because they're in, you know, in years past they would automatically qualify because they were in North America. To see them kind of be put in a qualifying situation and get the job done, I think is really important for them as well, especially when they have their eyes set on co-hosting the World Cup in 2026. So for them to take a step like that and actually go through and make it out of qualify for the tournament, as I think is also big for them too, in a larger spectrum.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, with Canada having so many young players and so many good players on their U16 teams, to see their national team have to go through that struggle and want to avoid that, I think is a really good lesson for them. When you've got other places, I mean, because, you know, we can side eye the Central American nations all that we want, but when I look at what Guyana and Bermuda have done now to get into this tournament, with the way that they did, you know, more than just one big statement win, they did it with a consistent dominance of their opponent. And that ultimately is the big issue, is that if you are consistently showing that you can win these group stages in the qualifying to get to the table, then you're already doing a good situation. Because specifically, this is something that these guys have to be paying attention to in developing their countries. And I think that for these lower ones, the Martiniques, the Curaçaos, the Bermudas, the Guianas, this is exactly what was needed, because you are only moving these forward as they as the player pool develops, and you have to be putting those Central American teams on blast a little bit just by, you know, being there, which I think is a big factor.
Yeah, I agree. I think with those countries, like you said, especially those island countries, you need to start creating a culture of winning and creating a mentality and creating expectations of getting victories within their region. I think that's very important. And we talk about, you know, other sports as well, and you see it with other franchises or other teams where once things go bad, it creates kind of a culture of losing. And I think that's kind of what's happened when we want to look at Guatemala, when we want to look at El Salvador, and what's the opposites happen when you look at Curacao and you look at Guyana. They're starting to create, and Jamaica, they're creating a culture of expectations of succeeding within their region. And these kind of small steps are huge in those regards when you look at wanting to take, you know, minimal steps in what's looked at in global soccer, but in the region they're huge steps, and they're very important for these islands to start producing more players and to get players involved to want to play. And, you know, just the overall aspect, it's huge for them in those regards too.
When looking at this bracket or the group stages for where we're at, with the Gold Cup. The seeding has not yet happened. Seeding will be I just had it. Where did it go?
I think April 10th is a draw. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, April 10th is when it is going to be. So about 2 weeks from now, the 4 seeded teams that will be in the group will be Mexico, United States, Costa Rica, and Honduras. U.S. will host Group D. Group A will be Mexico, B is Costa Rica, and C is Honduras. Those 4 are separated. Trinidad and Tobago, as well as Panama, are also up there in the hex qualifiers, the ones that we remember from World Cup qualifying that could potentially be in the groups. And I'm not sure how they will continue to make sure that the final pairings will work out the rest of the way, but that will be on April 10th. As far as the pools go, is there a team that you do not want to face in the pool stage?
I think if I had to pick one, I think it's going to be between Jamaica or Trinidad. Number one, I think Jamaica, just because they've shown success the last couple of tournaments. They beat Mexico 2 years ago in the semifinals to make it to the finals. Trinidad, just because they made it to a hex. I think both of them have the kind of style that would frustrate a Mexican. I'm thinking about it in the Mexican perspective, just because that's what I usually think about when we talk about the regional soccer. And so if I'm Mexico, playing Jamaica or playing Trinidad and Tobago are going to be the struggles, just because their style of play is the kind of style that frustrates Mexico and has had success over them in the tournament the last couple of editions too. And it's really hard. The U.S. found out during qualifying too that it's hard to play against two teams in Trinidad and Tobago, so you never want to be outnumbered in that regard.
Well, United States has 50 United States. You would think that they'd be able to beat Trinidad and Tobago, but I mean, that World Cup qualifying, they couldn't beat Trinidad or Tobago, so it didn't really matter. But even with that setup, I think that there's enough, Trinidad and Tobago is the obvious one, because I'll take the United States approach on this one, is that the United States will know not to lose to Trinidad and Tobago again. That will never happen. In this next tournament, not until after the next World Cup do you have to worry about losing to Trinidad and Tobago, just because of how big of a loss that was, and really just kind of the arrogance and exceptionalism that Bruce Arena has really just leached onto American soccer is fully culminated in that 2-0 loss to Trinidad and Tobago. So it will be completely absolved if they play. But that means that there's other teams that can catch you by surprise. I look at Canada with how young they are, and the fact that there's a number of Canadian players that are popping up in the MLS that would have the confidence to go up against guys from the United States. I think Canada could be a team that maybe doesn't get the win, but would tack on a goal late to equalize and drop you out of that first place role, causing a harder opening round matchup when you get into the knockout stage. I could see a team like Haiti, where they kind of have an inflated chip on their shoulder because they won the qualifying, where they could, all right, now that we've won that, we continue on with our push. And then I would also agree with Jamaica as well, just because Jamaica, man, they find a way in tournaments. They just have that bravado. I don't want to say bravado, but resiliency when they're in tournament play. Both the men and the women. It's just something that Jamaica is. They are a surprisingly clutch soccer nation.
Yeah, they have such a belief in themselves in the region, both male and female. I think they have such a belief in that they can win these games against a lot of the teams in the region. So I agree with you on that. Also, if I was Mexico, I'd be scared against El Salvador because even if they're down 4-0, they're still going to be kicking the ankles all for minutes. So that would be the biggest fear for Mexico to try to. Are there going to be enough bodies to make it to the next game if they play El Salvador?
All right, we got about a minute to go. Let's wrap up this week with your shout-out. What's your shout-out, Yvonne?
My shout-out's going to be to Danny Rose, Callum Hudson-Odoi, and Raheem Sterling, who stood up to the Montenegro fans under qualifier just this last week when they were giving them racist chants, and how they handled it with class. They made it known. This is a larger issue that's happening all over soccer, but the way those three they handled it for England, I thought was class, and I hope it continues to spread a light on the problems that there are in racism in soccer.
That is, of course, in the Euro qualifiers, match day 2. Those games are wrapping up right now, so we'll have a feature on that next week. For Yvonne Sanchez Carrasco, I'm Brice Burge, and you have listened to Your Soccer Passport here on Public House Media.